Death in the Rose Garden. Dear listeners, welcome back to Tea Time Mysteries. I'm your host Henry, and I'm glad you're here. Wherever you're listening from across Asia, these cosy Miss Marple mysteries bring us together. Tonight's story was chosen by our community. Thank you for being part of this journey. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're listening from. Now pour your tea and let's begin. Chapter 1. Roses in Full Bloom. The village of Little Wetherby prided itself on being exactly what it appeared to be. Tidy hedges, punctual church bells, and a general air of benevolent watchfulness that passed for community spirit. On that particular Saturday afternoon in June, the illusion was at its most convincing. The annual Rose Garden Fête was in full progress, and the grounds of Hawthorne House lay spread beneath a sky so obligingly blue that several villagers later remarked it felt almost indecent. Rows of roses, climbing, shrub, tea, and floribunda formed careful avenues of colour. Crimson, blush, ivory and gold bloomed in disciplined abundance, their labels written in Lady Hawthorne's precise hand. Tables had been set along the gravel paths with lace cloths and china cups, and the Women's Guild bustled about dispensing tea, sandwiches and unsolicited opinions. Miss Jane Marple sat slightly apart, as she preferred, on a wrought-iron bench near the oldest rose arbour. She wore her usual straw hat, trimmed with a modest ribbon, and held a cup of tea she had already allowed to grow cold. From this position she could observe nearly everything of importance, while appearing to do nothing at all. It was, she reflected, very much like village life itself. Lady Beatrice Hawthorne moved through her garden like a general inspecting well-trained troops. Tall, silver-haired, and impeccably dressed despite the heat, she accepted compliments on her roses with a smile that suggested she considered them only just adequate. Her husband, Colonel Arthur Hawthorne, retired, followed several steps behind, nodding gravely at acquaintances and occasionally glancing at his watch, as though the entire afternoon were an exercise in endurance. Near the tea table, Gerald Pritchard, chairman of the parish council and owner of the local estate agency, was holding forth on the inevitable decline of village standards. His wife, Monica, smiled too brightly at everyone who passed, her eyes darting like a nervous bird's. Further along the path, Evelyn Carter, the village schoolteacher, stood in earnest conversation with Dr. Simon Wells. Little Wetherby's GP, both of them speaking in low voices that ceased abruptly whenever anyone approached. Miss Marple watched them all with mild interest. People she had long observed behaved in remarkably consistent ways when placed in familiar patterns. A fete, she knew, was an excellent place to see those patterns laid bare. The roses, however, were Lady Hawthorne's true pride. One bed in particular, near the stone wall at the far end of the garden, drew a steady stream of admirers. It contained a rare and temperamental variety known as Queen Adelaide, its petals a deep velvety red that darkened almost to black at the edges. "It's all in the pruning," Lady Hawthorne was saying briskly to a small knot of listeners. "One mustn't be sentimental about such things," Miss Marple smiled faintly. Sentimentality, she thought, was rarely absent from village affairs, particularly when people insisted it was not there. At precisely 4 o'clock, the bell for the charity raffle was rung. The vicar cleared his throat and raised his hand for silence. Tickets were produced, murmurs hushed, and Lady Hawthorne herself stepped forward to draw the winning number. She reached into the basket, and then she screamed. It was not a melodramatic scream, nor a particularly loud one, but it carried with it a note of genuine shock that froze the garden into sudden stillness. Every head turned toward the rosebed by the stone wall. Someone had fallen among the Queen Adelaide roses. For a moment it was unclear who it was. Then Dr. Wells pushed forward, his face already set in professional lines, and knelt beside the still figure. A murmur rippled outward, growing louder as recognition dawned. It was Colonel Hawthorne. He lay on his back, one arm twisted beneath him, his face an alarming shade of grey. The roses around him were crushed and broken, their dark petals scattered across the grass like drops of dried blood. "Stand back, please," Dr. Wells said sharply. He placed 2 fingers against the Colonel's neck, then stilled. His expression changed, subtly but unmistakably. "I'm afraid," he said, rising slowly, "that Colonel Hawthorne is dead." The words fell into the garden with a dreadful finality. Someone gasped. Someone else began to cry. Lady Hawthorne stood very straight, her gloved hands clenched at her sides. staring down at her husband as though he were a stranger she did not quite recognise. "Nonsense," she said at last. "Arthur was perfectly well this morning." Dr. Wells hesitated. "There is no sign of injury from the fall," he said carefully. "It may have been sudden, a heart attack perhaps." "But he was arguing with Gerald only moments ago," Monica Pritchard said breathlessly. "I saw them. They looked quite upset." Gerald Pritchard flushed. "That's absurd. It was a trivial disagreement." Voices rose, overlapping, each person contributing a fragment of observation or speculation. Someone mentioned that the Colonel had complained of dizziness. Someone else recalled seeing a stranger near the rose beds earlier. The vicar attempted to restore order and failed. Throughout it all, Miss Marple remained seated. She had noticed, just before the scream, a small thing, so small that it seemed hardly worth remembering. Colonel Hawthorne had not looked angry or unwell as he walked toward the rose bed. He had looked puzzled. And Lady Hawthorne, watching him from across the lawn, had gone very still indeed. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. It was extraordinary, she reflected, how often death chose moments of maximum inconvenience. A garden fete, after all, was not the place for such things. And yet, human nature being what it was, perhaps there could have been no better place at all. As the first police car arrived at the gates of Hawthorne House, and the roses stirred gently in the warm afternoon breeze, little Weatherby's perfect surface began, at last, to crack. Chapter 2. Whispers among the hedges. By the time the police cordon had been strung around the rose garden, the fete had ceased to exist in all but name. Teacups stood abandoned on tables, raffle tickets fluttered across the lawn, and the carefully planned afternoon dissolved into clusters of anxious villagers speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Little Weatherby had always enjoyed a good piece of gossip, but this was something altogether different. Miss Marple was among the last to rise from her bench. She did so slowly, with the air of an elderly woman reluctant to cause trouble, and allowed herself to be shepherded toward the house with the others. From her vantage point, she observed the way people arranged themselves instinctively, who sought comfort, who sought authority, and who sought invisibility. Lady Hawthorne had been persuaded, gently but firmly, into the drawing-room. She sat very upright on the edge of a chair, refusing the glass of brandy offered by the vicar's wife. "I do not drink spirits before dinner," she said, her voice crisp. "It encourages laxity." Colonel Hawthorne's death, it appeared, had not altered her principles. Inspector Lionel Graves arrived shortly thereafter, a solid man with a dependable face and an expression that suggested he preferred facts to feelings. He listened carefully as Dr. Wells repeated his preliminary assessment. "There are no visible injuries," the doctor said. "The colonel may have collapsed before he fell. Of course, a post-mortem will be necessary." Inspector Graves nodded. "And until then, I must ask that no one leaves the village." This announcement caused a predictable stir. "Surely that won't be necessary," Gerald Pritchard protested. "We're respectable people." "Yes," said the inspector mildly, "so I'm told." Miss Marple, seated quietly near the window, noticed how Monica Pritchard's hand tightened on her husband's sleeve at that moment, and how Evelyn Carter stared resolutely at the carpet, her lips pressed into a thin line. Outside, the rose garden lay silent and cordoned, the crushed Queen Adelaide roses already beginning to wilt in the heat. A constable stood guard, looking faintly embarrassed by the whole affair. As the inspector began speaking individually with those present at the fete, the drawing-room slowly emptied. Miss Marple remained behind with Lady Hawthorne, who seemed quite content to sit in silence. "It is most unfortunate," Lady Hawthorne said at last. Arthur detested disorder. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed gently, "and yet it so often finds us." Lady Hawthorne looked at her sharply, then seemed to recognise her at last. "You are Miss Marple, are you not? From St. Mary Mead?" "That's right," said Miss Marple. "I'm staying with my nephew in Much Benham, but I do enjoy a good rose garden." "So did Arthur," Lady Hawthorne said, "though he preferred them tidy." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Men often do." When the inspector returned, he began with Lady Hawthorne. She answered his questions with precision. Yes, her husband had been in good health. No, he had not mentioned feeling unwell. Yes, they had quarrelled that morning, but only about the placement of the tea tables. Inspector Graves scribbled notes. "And did Colonel Hawthorne have any enemies?" Lady Hawthorne's lips tightened. "Arthur was not the sort of man to inspire enemies. Opposition, perhaps, resentment. But that is inevitable in village life." Miss Marple thought of the look on the Colonel's face just before his death. Puzzled, expectant. Outside, Gerald Pritchard was speaking animatedly to Dr. Wells. "I'm telling you, he looked furious," Gerald insisted. "We argued about the sale of the old mill cottage. He accused me of undervaluing it deliberately." Dr. Wells frowned. "That hardly seems a matter to kill over." "No," Gerald said quickly. "Of course not. I only mean, well, it's all very odd, isn't it?" Evelyn Carter hovered nearby, clearly wishing to leave but unable to do so without appearing suspicious. When Inspector Graves finally turned his attention to her, she startled. Yes, Colonel Hawthorne was a governor at the school," she said. "We disagreed sometimes. He was very traditional." "Did you see him shortly before his death?" the inspector asked. "Yes. No. I mean, only from a distance." Her answers were correct, Miss Marple thought, but curiously incomplete. By early evening, the official verdict was still sudden death, pending further examination. Nevertheless, the word murder hovered unspoken in the air, like a wasp no one wished to acknowledge. The villagers drifted home in subdued groups, already rehearsing their versions of events. Miss Marple walked slowly back through the lanes, accompanied for a time by Monica Pritchard. "It's dreadful," Monica said, lowering her voice. "Poor Lady Hawthorne. Still, she always was a difficult woman." Miss Marple smiled. "Grief affects people differently." "Yes," Monica said quickly. "Of course." As they parted, Miss Marple paused by a low hedge and looked back toward Hawthorne House. The rose garden lay beyond, dark now, its scents heavy in the evening air. She thought again of that small, unimportant detail. The Colonel's expression. Not fear, not anger, expectation. An expectation she knew was rarely without cause. Somewhere in Little Wetherby, a secret had begun to stir. Chapter 3. A Very Natural Death. Sunday morning in Little Wetherby dawned with deceptive normality. Church bells rang as they always had, the bakery opened at 8, and the village green looked precisely as it should. Trim, orderly, and serene. Only the subdued manner of the villagers betrayed the fact that Colonel Hawthorne lay dead at Hawthorne House, awaiting removal for a post-mortem examination. Miss Marple attended morning service, as she considered it both proper and informative to do so. Tragedy, she had long observed, encouraged people to reveal themselves in small but significant ways. Some clung to ritual, some to distraction, and others to confession, though not always the sort made aloud. Lady Hawthorne occupied her usual pew, dressed in severe black, her back straight, and her expression unreadable. She sang the hymns clearly and without emotion. Gerald Pritchard, by contrast, fidgeted constantly, his attention wandering from the pulpit to the door and back again. Evelyn Carter arrived late and slipped into a seat near the aisle. Her cheeks flushed as though she had walked quickly. After the service, the churchyard filled with cautious conversation. Inspector Graves was present, unobtrusively speaking with the vicar while observing everything else. Miss Marple found herself joined by Dr. Wells. "I hear you were quite close to the rose garden yesterday," he said conversationally. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I like to see how things grow." Dr. Wells smiled faintly. "You'll be pleased to know that, medically speaking, this may all be very straightforward. The Colonel had an undiagnosed heart condition. Sudden collapse is entirely plausible." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "And yet," Dr. Wells prompted. She tilted her head. "He chose a very particular place to collapse, did he not?" Dr. Wells frowned slightly. "You think he went there deliberately?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that people often go where they believe something, pleasant or unpleasant, is about to happen." Dr. Wells regarded her for a moment, then gave a polite laugh. "Village speculation, Miss Marple. Quite natural under the circumstances." "Yes," she agreed, "very natural." That afternoon, the post-mortem was conducted in the nearby town. Inspector Graves remained in Little Wetherby, continuing his quiet inquiries. He called first at Hawthorne House. Lady Hawthorne received him in the morning room, where the scent of roses lingered faintly despite the closed windows. "I trust you are satisfied that this was no criminal matter," she said coolly. "Not yet, Lady Hawthorne," the inspector replied. "There are certain questions." "Of course." "Did your husband receive any unusual correspondence recently?" She considered. "Arthur received letters daily, some official, some personal. Nothing struck me as remarkable." And did he mention meeting anyone in the garden before the fete? No. The inspector paused. He was seen walking toward the Queen Adelaide Roses shortly before his death. Was there any reason he might have gone there? Lady Hawthorn's eyes flickered just briefly. They required inspection. On the day of a fete? They are my finest roses, she said sharply. Arthur understood their importance. The inspector thanked her and left. Meanwhile, gossip flourished elsewhere. At the village shop, Monica Pritchard whispered to anyone who would listen that Colonel Hawthorn had been under tremendous stress. At his age, you know, she said, and Lady Hawthorn was never easy to live with. Gerald Pritchard, for his part, insisted to the postman that the Colonel had been furious with him. I wouldn't be surprised if he worked himself into a state, he said loudly. Evelyn Carter told no one anything at all. Miss Marple visited the shop that afternoon, purchasing a modest assortment of groceries she did not particularly need. She listened carefully, asking occasional harmless questions. Heart attacks are so sudden, the shopkeeper said. You never know when they'll strike. No, said Miss Marple, but sometimes one can see the signs afterward. What signs are those? Oh, little things, Miss Marple said vaguely. That evening, Inspector Graves received the preliminary post-mortem report. Cause of death: cardiac arrest. However, there was a complication. Trace amounts of digitalis had been found in Colonel Hawthorn's system. Digitalis, the inspector knew, could be a legitimate medication, or a poison, depending on dosage. Dr. Wells was summoned at once. Digitalis, he said slowly. I did not prescribe it for the Colonel. Could he have obtained it himself? Unlikely. It requires careful monitoring. And could it have caused his collapse? Dr. Wells hesitated. In sufficient quantity, yes. The word murder no longer hovered unspoken. It had entered the room. Inspector Graves ordered further inquiries. Attention turned inevitably to Lady Hawthorn. Miss Marple heard the news from the vicar's wife, who was quite beside herself with excitement. Poison, she whispered, just like in the books. Yes, said Miss Marple, and just as untidy in real life. That night Miss Marple sat by the window of her nephew's house, knitting slowly. She replayed the events of the fete in her mind. The Colonel's walk toward the roses, Lady Hawthorn's stillness, the argument Gerald claimed to have had. Evelyn Carter's sudden pallor. Digitalis, she reflected, was derived from foxglove, a common garden plant. She thought of Lady Hawthorn's roses, so carefully tended, so ruthlessly pruned. But Lady Hawthorn was too obvious. Villagers, like people, rarely concealed their worst secrets in the most visible places. Miss Marple considered instead the matter of access. Who had the opportunity to administer the poison? And more importantly, how? The Colonel had not been seen eating or drinking immediately before his death, unless, of course, it had not been given then at all. Expectation, she thought again. The Colonel had expected something at the rose bed, a meeting. And meetings, Miss Marple knew, were rarely accidental. Somewhere in Little Wetherby, someone was waiting very anxiously for the inspector's next move. Chapter 4. The Obvious Suspect. By Monday morning, Little Wetherby had reached a collective conclusion. It was not, strictly speaking, agreed upon aloud, but it permeated every conversation, every lifted eyebrow, every lowered voice. Lady Hawthorn, with her iron discipline and formidable will, had finally been revealed. So the village decided, as exactly the sort of woman who might poison her husband and stand calmly by while the roses bloomed. Inspector Graves was well aware of this unspoken verdict. He was also aware that such conclusions, while convenient, were often dangerously misleading. Nevertheless, it was Lady Hawthorn who sat opposite him once more in the morning room at Hawthorn House, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. "You are suggesting," she said, "that I poisoned my husband with digitalis." "I am suggesting nothing yet," Inspector Graves replied. "I am asking questions." "Very well. Digitalis is derived from foxglove. Do you grow foxglove in your garden?" "Yes," Lady Hawthorn said without hesitation. "Along the north wall, they are quite ornamental." "Do you prepare your own herbal remedies?" "Certainly not. Such things are imprecise." The inspector studied her. "Did you prepare any food or drink for your husband on the day of the fete?" "Only breakfast, tea and toast." "And you shared it?" "Yes." The inspector paused. Colonel Hawthorn did not collapse until several hours later. Lady Hawthorn's mouth tightened. Are you implying delayed action? I am considering it. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting, glanced up. Digitalis does act slowly. Does it not? She asked mildly. Inspector Graves nodded. In certain forms, yes. Lady Hawthorne turned her sharp gaze on Miss Marple. I do not meddle in poisons, she said coldly. If my husband had taken Digitalis, it was without my knowledge. The inspector rose. Thank you, Lady Hawthorne. As he left, he asked Miss Marple to walk a short distance with him in the garden. You have opinions, he said. Only observations, Miss Marple replied. They are quite different things. Then observe this. Lady Hawthorne had access, opportunity and motive, control of the estate, long-standing marital friction. Yes, said Miss Marple, and a lifetime of efficiency, which makes me wonder why she would choose such a conspicuous method. Inspector Graves frowned. Poison is subtle. Only when used subtly, Miss Marple said. This was discovered almost at once. They paused near the rose bed, now stripped of its damaged blooms. Miss Marple looked down. If Lady Hawthorne had intended to kill her husband, she would have done so in a manner that left no questions at all. Inside the village, the inspector's next inquiries moved outward. Gerald Pritchard was summoned to the station. You quarrelled with Colonel Hawthorne, Inspector Graves said. Hardly a quarrel, Gerald protested, a disagreement over property valuation. And you were heard raising your voice. Gerald shifted. Arthur, Colonel Hawthorne, was provoking. Did you meet him later? No. Did you arrange to meet him? Gerald hesitated. No. But hesitation, the inspector noted, was often more revealing than words. Meanwhile, Evelyn Carter was questioned at the schoolhouse. You seem nervous, Inspector Graves said. Wouldn't you be? She replied tightly. Did Colonel Hawthorne have reason to be displeased with you? Yes, she said at once. He opposed my proposal to modernize the curriculum. And personally, she hesitated, he could be unkind. Did you see him before his death? Yes, briefly. Where? In the rose garden. Inspector Graves looked up sharply. You told me you only saw him from a distance. Yes, I passed him. I didn't speak. Did he speak to you? She swallowed. He said he wished to talk later. Later when? At the fete. Inspector Graves thanked her and left. When Miss Marple heard of this exchange, she nodded to herself. The Colonel had arranged a meeting then, or perhaps more than one. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the north wall of Hawthorne House. The foxgloves stood tall and purple, their bells nodding gently. She did not touch them. Instead, she examined the soil nearby and noticed something curious. A small patch where the earth appeared recently disturbed, then carefully smoothed over. Miss Marple straightened slowly. It was, she thought, very much like village life itself, messy beneath the surface, tidy on top. By evening, Inspector Graves had formed his working theory. Lady Hawthorne, with her botanical knowledge and access to foxglove, had administered Digitalis to her husband, perhaps in his breakfast tea. The delayed effect explained the timing. The argument at the fete provided emotional cover. The rose garden offered a dramatic setting. An arrest, the inspector knew, would be popular. Miss Marple, however, sat quietly in her nephew's sitting room, knitting and frowning slightly. Digitalis was a precise poison. Lady Hawthorne was a precise woman. But precision, Miss Marple reflected, did not always equate to guilt, and someone in Little Wetherby was relying very heavily on that assumption. Chapter 5. A minor detail. Inspector Graves did not arrest Lady Hawthorne that evening, though he came closer than the village would ever know. Prudence, or perhaps a lingering doubt, stayed his hand. Instead, he ordered further laboratory analysis and continued his inquiries with renewed focus. It was precisely this delay that allowed Miss Marple's thoughts to settle upon a detail so small that it might easily have escaped anyone else's notice. She had been turning it over in her mind since her walk along the north wall, not the foxgloves themselves, but the way Colonel Hawthorne had moved toward the rose bed. He had not wandered. He had not hesitated. He had walked with purpose, as though he had been told exactly where to go. On Tuesday morning, Miss Marple returned to Hawthorne House, ostensibly to offer condolences. Lady Hawthorne received her with stiff courtesy. "You have been very quiet," Lady Hawthorne remarked. "People who are quiet often think too much." "I find it useful," Miss Marple said pleasantly. They walked together along the gravel path. My husband loved order, Lady Hawthorne said. He disliked surprises. And yet, Miss Marple said, he seemed to expect one that afternoon. Lady Hawthorne stopped. What do you mean? He looked puzzled, Miss Marple said gently. Not angry, not frightened. Lady Hawthorne stared at the rose bed. Arthur was often puzzled by the behaviour of others. Were you expecting him there? Miss Marple asked. No, Lady Hawthorne said sharply. Miss Marple let the matter drop. Later that day, Miss Marple visited Evelyn Carter, under the pretence of delivering a jar of homemade jam. I thought you might like it, Miss Marple said. Teaching is very demanding. Evelyn accepted it with a trembling smile. You were seen near the rose bed, Miss Marple said conversationally. Yes. You passed Colonel Hawthorne. Yes. And he asked to speak with you later. Evelyn hesitated. He said it was important. Important enough to arrange a meeting? I don't know. Miss Marple watched her carefully. Did he seem angry? No, Evelyn said quickly. He seemed hopeful. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. Hopeful? Yes. As though he believed matters might be resolved. Miss Marple thanked her and left. Hopeful was not the demeanour of a man who believed he was about to be poisoned by his wife. That afternoon, Inspector Graves received the laboratory report. The digitalis present in Colonel Hawthorne's system was not from foxglove leaves steeped crudely, but from a refined preparation, precisely measured. Someone with access to medication, he said slowly. Such as a doctor, his sergeant suggested. Dr. Wells was questioned again. I keep digitalis locked, he said, and I account for every dose. And the school infirmary? Inspector Graves asked suddenly. Dr. Wells frowned. That is a very old cupboard. I doubt it's been used in years. Miss Marple, hearing this later, smiled to herself. Schools, she knew, were excellent places for forgotten things. That evening, a second shock struck little Weatherby. Evelyn Carter failed to appear at school the next morning. Her cottage was found empty, her suitcase gone. The village erupted. She's run away, Monica Pritchard cried, just like a guilty person would. Inspector Graves issued a bulletin. Miss Marple, however, sat quietly and considered the matter. Evelyn Carter had looked frightened, but not of the police. She had looked frightened of being misunderstood. Running away, Miss Marple thought, was a very poor substitute for explaining oneself, but it was also a very effective way to draw attention away from someone else. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. Someone in Little Weatherby had planned very carefully indeed, and they were counting on the village to make all the wrong assumptions for them. Chapter 6. Threads begin to tangle. Evelyn Carter's disappearance transformed suspicion into something sharper and far less comfortable. By mid-morning, Little Weatherby had abandoned its tentative politeness and embraced certainty with enthusiasm. Guilt, the village agreed, had finally shown its hand. Inspector Graves did not share this confidence. He stood in Evelyn Carter's cottage, a small, tidy place with mismatched furniture and shelves crowded with books. Nothing appeared disturbed. A single teacup sat rinsed and placed neatly by the sink. Clothes had been taken carefully, practically folded, not hurriedly stuffed. This isn't flight, the inspector murmured. It's retreat. Miss Marple, allowed to observe under the guise of neighbourly concern, nodded. When women run in a panic, she said gently, they forget things. Hairbrushes. Letters. This was done thoughtfully. You think she's innocent? Inspector Graves said. I think she's afraid, Miss Marple replied, and fear does not always belong to the guilty. A folded note lay on the small writing desk. Inspector Graves read it aloud. I cannot stay and be judged for something I did not do. I need time to think. Please forgive me. Not very helpful, he said. No, Miss Marple agreed, but very revealing. How so? She does not deny knowledge, Miss Marple said, only responsibility. Inspector Graves looked at her sharply. Elsewhere in the village, reactions were less measured. Gerald Pritchard took the opportunity to speak loudly and often. I always thought there was something odd about her, he told anyone who paused long enough. Kept to herself. Modern ideas. No family ties, Monica Pritchard nodded vigorously. And she was seen with the Colonel. It's obvious, really. Dr. Wells said little, but his expression was troubled. He paid a visit to Inspector Graves that afternoon. I keep thinking, he said slowly, about the dosage. Digitalis must be administered very carefully. Too much kills, too little merely weakens. And you believe Colonel Hawthorne's dose was deliberate? Inspector Graves said. Yes. Then the person responsible knew exactly what they were doing. Dr. Wells hesitated. That knowledge is uncommon. Inspector Graves thanked him and added a new column to his notes. Miss Marple spent the afternoon walking. She passed the school, the shop, the vicarage, and finally the rose garden itself. The cordon had been lifted, though the damaged bed remained conspicuously bare, its emptiness more noticeable than the roses ever had been. She paused there, remembering. Colonel Hawthorne had arrived early to the fete. He had spoken briefly with Gerald Pritchard, then moved away. He had passed Evelyn Carter, who looked startled, and then he had gone directly to the rose bed. Someone, Miss Marple concluded, had told him to do so. She recalled Evelyn's word. Hopeful. Hopeful people believed promises. That evening Inspector Graves received a telephone call from the local chemist in the nearby town. There's something you ought to know, the chemist said. A prescription for digitalis was filled last week, not for Colonel Hawthorne. Inspector Graves leaned forward. For whom, then? For Lady Hawthorne, the chemist replied, issued by Dr. Wells. Dr. Wells was summoned immediately. Yes, he admitted. Lady Hawthorne complained of palpitations, mild dosage only, entirely safe. And where was the medication kept? In her dressing room. Inspector Graves closed his notebook slowly. The evidence was tightening, once again, around Lady Hawthorne. When Miss Marple was informed, she did not look surprised. May I ask, she said, whether the tablets were in their original bottle? Yes. And how many remain? Dr. Wells frowned. I did not count. Miss Marple smiled faintly. People rarely do. Inspector Graves looked at her intently. You think the tablets were diverted? I think, Miss Marple said, that Lady Hawthorne's medicine was a most convenient source. And you think she allowed that? No, Miss Marple said softly. I think she never noticed. That night Lady Hawthorne sent for Miss Marple. You're convinced of my innocence, Lady Hawthorne said abruptly. I am convinced of your character, Miss Marple replied, which is not quite the same thing. Lady Hawthorne's lips thinned. I loved my husband in my way. I believe you, Miss Marple said, and I believe you would never risk scandal. Lady Hawthorne looked away. Arthur intended to make changes. Changes. To his will. Miss Marple's knitting paused. He meant to leave money to the school, Lady Hawthorne said stiffly, and to certain individuals I do not approve of. Such as Evelyn Carter? Lady Hawthorne did not answer. Miss Marple said nothing further. When she returned home, she sat for a long time without knitting. Money, she reflected, altered behaviour far more reliably than emotion. The next morning brought another development. Evelyn Carter was found. She had taken refuge with an aunt several miles away, and encouraged by Inspector Graves' assurances, returned to Little Wetherby. She arrived pale but determined. I will not hide, she said, not any more. In Inspector Graves's office she spoke haltingly. Colonel Hawthorne asked me to meet him in the rose garden, she said. He said he intended to resolve matters. What matters? Inspector Graves asked. He planned to support my proposal at the next council meeting, Evelyn said, and he meant to leave a sum of money to the school. Inspector Graves stiffened. He told you this? Yes. And did you meet him? No, Evelyn said, her voice breaking. I arrived late. When I reached the rose bed, people were already screaming. Did you give him anything? Inspector Graves asked. No. Miss Marple watched her closely. What frightened you, my dear? She asked gently. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. Everyone would think I did it. I had motive, opportunity, and no one would believe me. Miss Marple reached out and patted her hand. That afternoon, Inspector Graves reviewed his suspects. Lady Hawthorne, access to digitalis, motive via the will but too visible. Evelyn Carter, motive, meeting arranged but no means. Dr. Wells, knowledge, access, but no apparent reason. And then there was Gerald Pritchard, estate agent, parish council chairman, deeply invested in village property. Inspector Graves recalled the mill cottage dispute. He recalled Gerald's eagerness to talk, and he recalled something Miss Marple had said days earlier. Villages rarely hide their worst secrets in the most visible places. That evening, Inspector Graves paid an unannounced visit to Gerald Pritchard's office. Gerald looked startled. "Inspector, this is unexpected." "Yes," Inspector Graves said. "So is murder." Gerald laughed nervously. "Surely not. Did Colonel Hawthorne intend to revise his will?" Gerald blinked. Possibly. Did he intend to oppose a development proposal you supported?" Gerald's smile faded. Inspector Graves leaned forward. "And did you arrange to meet him in the rose garden?" Gerald swallowed. Outside, the roses stirred in the dusk. Miss Marple, knitting quietly at home, felt the first satisfying tug of a thread being pulled into place. The pattern, at last, was beginning to emerge. Chapter 7. False Patterns. Inspector Graves did not press Gerald Pritchard that evening. Experience had taught him that men like Pritchard, voluble, self-assured, and deeply conscious of their own respectability, revealed far more when given time to arrange their own explanations. He left the office with cordial politeness, allowing Gerald to believe, if only for the moment, that nothing damaging had been uncovered. Gerald, however, did not sleep well. The following morning, little Weatherby awoke to yet another refinement of its collective opinion. The schoolteacher, now safely returned, was no longer the villain of the piece. Instead, suspicion swung back, predictably, toward Lady Hawthorne, bolstered by whispered references to wills, money, and her formidable personality. "She always ruled him," Monica Pritchard said knowingly at the shop, "and now she'll rule the house alone." Miss Marple listened, her basket resting on her arm. "Power," she said mildly, "is not always the same as desire." Monica blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Oh, nothing important," Miss Marple replied. "Just something I once observed in St. Mary Mead." That afternoon, Inspector Graves received confirmation that Colonel Hawthorne's will had indeed been altered, though not finalised. A draft, prepared by a solicitor in the nearby town, proposed a modest endowment for the village school and a charitable trust that would, inconveniently, reduce Gerald Pritchard's long-anticipated profit from a housing development on the edge of the parish. It would have blocked his plans entirely, the inspector murmured. "Yes," said Miss Marple, who had been invited, quite unofficially, to hear the summary. "And people are often surprisingly emotional about land. What troubles me," Inspector Graves continued, "is the method. Digitalis requires knowledge." "Or access to someone else's knowledge," Miss Marple said. Inspector Graves glanced at her. "Dr. Wells?" "Not necessarily," Miss Marple replied. "Doctors are careful. Other people are curious." She rose and walked to the window. "May I ask," she said, "whether Colonel Hawthorne habitually took sugar in his tea?" Inspector Graves frowned. "Yes, 2 lumps, I believe." "And Lady Hawthorne?" "None." Miss Marple nodded, as though a small internal ledger had been balanced. Later that day, Inspector Graves re-interviewed Dr. Wells. "You dispensed digitalis to Lady Hawthorne," he said. "Tablets?" "Yes." "And you explained the dosage carefully?" "Of course." "Did anyone else hear those instructions?" Dr. Wells hesitated. "Mrs. Pritchard was present when Lady Hawthorne collected the prescription. She happened to be visiting." Inspector Graves looked up sharply. Monica Pritchard, when questioned, was fluttery but cooperative. "I remember it perfectly," she said. "Lady Hawthorne asked such precise questions. 1 tablet daily, no more." "And did you see where the tablets were kept?" Inspector Graves asked. "In her dressing room," Monica said readily. "On the vanity." Inspector Graves made a note. That evening, Miss Marple paid a call on Gerald and Monica Pritchard. She was received with effusive courtesy. "How kind of you to come," Monica said, ushering her in. "Such dreadful times." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "and dreadfully confusing." They spoke of trivial matters at first. The weather, the roses, the unfortunate state of village morale. Gerald grew increasingly restless, glancing at the clock. "I wonder," Miss Marple said suddenly, "whether you remember, Mr. Pritchard, what time Colonel Hawthorne left your conversation at the fete?" Gerald frowned. "Just before 4, I suppose." "Before the raffle." "Yes." "And he went directly to the rose bed?" Gerald hesitated. "I assume so." "You didn't tell him to meet you there?" "No." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Of course not." She turned to Monica. "And you, my dear? You were helping with the tea?" "Yes." "Pouring, serving, arranging sugar," Monica laughed nervously. "There was quite a lot to do." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "and sugar bowls are so easily confused." There was a silence, brief, but heavy. Inspector Graves, reviewing his notes later that night, found himself circling the same names again and again. Gerald Pritchard had motive, opportunity, and a talent for persuasion. Monica Pritchard had access, proximity, and a fluttering eagerness to please. But neither had medical training. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat quietly and reconstructed the afternoon of the feat. The digitalis had been administered earlier, likely in tea. Colonel Hawthorne, unlike his wife, took sugar. A tablet crushed finely would dissolve easily. The effect would not be immediate. It would weaken him, make him susceptible. The meeting at the Rosebed was the final piece. Someone had summoned him there expecting or hoping for collapse. Expectation again. On Thursday morning, Inspector Graves received an unexpected visitor, Lady Hawthorne. "I wish to make a statement," she said stiffly. "Arthur told me he intended to confront Gerald Pritchard that afternoon, about his dishonest valuations." Inspector Graves looked up. "Did he say where?" "The Rose Garden," Lady Hawthorne replied. "He said Gerald would not make a scene there." Miss Marple, informed shortly afterward, closed her eyes briefly. Gerald Pritchard had known where the Colonel would be. He had known when. And, Miss Marple thought quietly, he had known exactly what sort of man would agree to meet someone among roses, trusting to civility and appearances. The pattern was nearly complete. But Miss Marple also knew that certainty, like gossip, must be tested, and she was already considering how best to do so, gently, politely, and quite decisively. Chapter 8. A deliberate experiment. Miss Marple believed very firmly that truth like a nervous horse was best approached quietly and from the side. Inspector Graves, though less inclined toward metaphor, had come to appreciate the value of her methods. When she suggested the following morning that a small social gathering might prove instructive, he did not dismiss the idea at once. "A gathering?" he repeated. "After everything that's happened?" "Yes," Miss Marple said serenely. "People behave quite differently when they think the worst is over." Inspector Graves considered. "And what exactly do you propose?" "Tea," said Miss Marple. "Nothing more alarming than that." Thus, it came about that Lady Hawthorne, after a moment's hesitation, agreed to host a modest afternoon tea for a few select villagers. Gerald and Monica Pritchard, Dr. Wells, Evelyn Carter, the vicar's wife, and Miss Marple herself. Inspector Graves would attend unobtrusively, under the guise of finalising routine inquiries. Little Weatherby buzzed with restrained excitement. Tea at Hawthorne House, after a death. Opinions varied sharply, but curiosity won out. Lady Hawthorne presided as she always had, her manner coolly correct. The table was laid with impeccable care. 2 teapots stood ready, one for ordinary tea, one, clearly labelled, for Lady Hawthorne's own herbal infusion. Miss Marple noticed this at once. "How thoughtful," she said gently. "It avoids confusion." Lady Hawthorne inclined her head. "I dislike mistakes." Gerald Pritchard arrived full of forced cheer. "Delighted to see things returning to normal," he boomed, though his laugh rang hollow. Monica fluttered behind him, glancing nervously at the teapots. Evelyn Carter sat very straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Dr. Wells looked faintly uncomfortable, as though he suspected the afternoon would not be purely social. Tea was poured. Miss Marple accepted her cup and waited. Gerald Pritchard, however, frowned. "I take sugar," he said, pushing his cup slightly forward. "Of course," Monica said quickly, reaching for the bowl. Miss Marple watched her hand, how it hovered for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Oh dear," Miss Marple said suddenly. "I'm afraid my cup has gone cold. May I trouble you for a fresh one, Lady Hawthorne?" Lady Hawthorne nodded and rose to the teapot reserved for guests. Miss Marple's discarded cup was placed discreetly on a side table. Inspector Graves, watching closely, noted that Monica Pritchard's eyes followed it. Conversation resumed. Village trivialities, carefully chosen and conspicuously harmless. Then Miss Marple spoke again. "I was thinking," she said, "about how easily misunderstandings arise. For instance, sugar bowls. They are so often refilled without much thought." Monica laughed nervously. "Really, Miss Marple, you do have the oddest notions." "Do I?" Miss Marple smiled. "In St. Mary Mead, a woman once confused aspirin with something quite different. It caused dreadful consequences." Gerald shifted in his chair. Inspector Graves cleared his throat. "Dr. Wells," he said casually, "how long does digitalis take to act?" Dr. Wells stiffened. "Several hours, depending on dosage. And if someone had taken it at breakfast, it would weaken the heart gradually." Gerald's face had gone slightly grey. Miss Marple set down her cup. "Inspector," she said mildly, "would you be so kind as to fetch my knitting from the side table? I believe I left it beside my other cup." Inspector Graves rose and did so. As he picked it up, he glanced inside the cup. There. Clinging to the bottom was a fine white residue. The room seemed suddenly very quiet. Inspector Graves turned to Gerald Pritchard. "You were anxious to speak with Colonel Hawthorne that afternoon," he said evenly. "Yes, no, I mean... And you knew Lady Hawthorne had been prescribed digitalis. Monica mentioned it. You argued with him about Mill Cottage," Inspector Graves continued, "and when that failed, you arranged to meet him privately. That's not... You persuaded your wife," the inspector went on, "to help you. She was already flustered, already eager to please. Sugar in tea, a crushed tablet, a delay long enough to provide an alibi." Monica began to sob. "I didn't know it would kill him," she cried. "Gerald said it would only frighten him, make him back down." Gerald stared at her in horror. "You fool," he whispered. Miss Marple spoke gently. "But digitalis is not a thing to experiment with, and Colonel Hawthorne's heart was weaker than you realised." Inspector Graves stepped forward. "Mr. Pritchard, you are under arrest for the murder of Colonel Hawthorne. Mrs. Pritchard, you will be charged as an accessory." Lady Hawthorne closed her eyes briefly. Evelyn Carter let out a shaky breath, as though she had been holding it for days. As Gerald was led away, Miss Marple gathered her knitting. "It is always a mistake," she said softly, "to believe that one can control consequences as carefully as roses." Chapter 9. The Quiet. After arrests, Miss Marple had often observed, produced two immediate effects in villages. The first was shock. The second, an intense and almost indecent relief that the guilty party had been identified and removed from polite society. Little Weatherby was no exception. By the evening of Gerald and Monica Pritchard's arrest, the village seemed to exhale as one. Curtains twitched, doors closed a little more firmly than usual, and conversations acquired a new, satisfied tone. So it wasn't Lady Hawthorne after all, people said, and the schoolteacher cleared too. Well, I always thought there was something false about Gerald. Miss Marple listened to none of it directly. She preferred the indirect evidence, the way people stood a little straighter now, the way voices lost their edge of suspicion. Order, of a sort, had been restored. Inspector Graves came to see her the following morning. "I wanted to thank you," he said simply. "That's very kind," Miss Marple replied, "though I only noticed what was already there." "You noticed rather more than most." Inspector Graves sat down. "Pritchard confessed fully last night. He claims he never intended to kill Hawthorne, only to weaken him, frighten him into withdrawing his objections." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "People often say that." "He used his wife," the inspector continued, "exploited her nervousness, her wish to be useful. She thought she was helping her husband protect their future." "A future," Miss Marple said softly, "is a very dangerous thing when it becomes more important than other people's lives." Inspector Graves nodded. "There's one thing I still don't quite understand. How did you know it was tea? Not biscuits, not luncheon?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because of habits. Lady Hawthorne drank herbal infusions from her own pot. Colonel Hawthorne drank ordinary tea with sugar. People are most easily harmed through what they do without thinking." Inspector Graves rose. "The case will go to trial, of course, but I doubt there will be much doubt about the outcome." After he left, Miss Marple sat quietly for a while, her knitting untouched. Justice, she reflected, was not the same thing as comfort. Later that day, Lady Hawthorne requested Miss Marple's company for a walk in the garden. The roses had begun to recover. New buds showed promise where crushed stems had once lain. The Queen Adelaide bed, though still sparse, was no longer empty. "I owe you an apology," Lady Hawthorne said abruptly. "I misjudged you." "That is quite all right," Miss Marple said. "I am often misjudged." Lady Hawthorne paused. "Arthur meant to do something kind, you know, for the school, for that girl." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and kindness sadly can provoke resentment as easily as cruelty." Lady Hawthorne's mouth tightened. Gerald Pritchard always resented this house, its position, its influence. Resentment, Miss Marple said gently, is a very patient emotion. They walked on in silence for a few moments. I shall carry on, Lady Hawthorne said at last. With the garden, with my duties. I'm sure you will, Miss Marple replied. Routine can be very healing. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a final visit to Evelyn Carter. I don't know how to thank you, Evelyn said, for believing me. Miss Marple smiled. Belief is not so important as listening. Evelyn hesitated. Colonel Hawthorne? He really did intend to help, didn't he? Yes, Miss Marple said. And I think he would be glad that his intentions were understood, at least in the end. As Miss Marple walked home through the village lanes, Little Weatherby looked very much as it always had. Neat cottages, clipped hedges, an air of modest respectability. Only the roses, she thought, remembered everything. That evening she packed her small suitcase. Her visit was nearly over. From her window she could see the distant outline of Hawthorne House, peaceful once more. Somewhere inside it life was resuming its accustomed rhythm. Miss Marple sat down, picked up her knitting, and reflected, as she so often did, that human nature, like a garden, required constant tending. Neglect it, and something poisonous was bound to take root. Tomorrow she would return to St. Mary Mead. Little Weatherby would go on just as it always had. And the roses would bloom again. Chapter 10. Ripples in Still Water. If Little Weatherby had expected peace to descend fully and immediately after the arrests, it was quietly disappointed. Villages, Miss Marple knew, did not absorb shocks so easily. They rippled, conversations echoed, certainties wavered before settling into something resembling acceptance. The Pritchard house stood dark and shuttered, its windows like eyes that refused to meet the gaze of passers-by. Monica Pritchard's sister arrived to collect a few personal belongings, doing so quickly and with averted eyes. Gerald Pritchard, once so fond of making himself heard, was spoken of now only in lowered tones, his name acquiring a strange, unfamiliar quality, as though it belonged to someone the village had never truly known. Miss Marple observed these developments from a distance. She had resumed her habit of walking each morning, greeting acquaintances with mild cordiality and allowing them to speak if they wished. Many did. It's such a shock, said the postmistress for the third time in 2 days. You think you know people? Yes, Miss Marple agreed. That is often the trouble. Inspector Graves remained in the village, tying up the many small but necessary threads that followed a case of this sort. Statements had to be formalised, evidence catalogued, timelines verified. The residue found in Miss Marple's teacup, now safely preserved, proved decisive, its chemical signature matching that of Lady Hawthorne's prescription exactly. It's remarkably clear, the inspector said, though his tone suggested no great pleasure in the fact. Pritchard persuaded his wife to administer the drug. He arranged the meeting. Everything else followed quite naturally. Most dreadful things do, Miss Marple said. Evelyn Carter returned to her classroom on Wednesday morning. The children, blissfully unconcerned with adult scandal, greeted her with enthusiasm and questions about arithmetic rather than murder. She found, to her surprise, that teaching felt steadier than it had in weeks. After school, she visited Hawthorne House. I wanted to thank you properly, she said to Lady Hawthorne, who received her in the morning room once more. Colonel Hawthorne believed in the school. I intend to see his wishes carried out. Lady Hawthorne regarded her for a long moment. Arthur was not always easy, she said at last, but he was sincere. If he trusted you, that is, something. It was, Miss Marple thought later, as close to approval as Lady Hawthorne was likely ever to give. The revised will, though never finalised, was honoured as far as possible. Legal complications delayed matters, but the intention was clear enough to satisfy both the solicitor and the village conscience. A modest endowment for the school was announced. The news was received with relief, and, in some quarters, faint embarrassment. It's what he would have wanted, people said, as though eager to align themselves with the sentiment now that it was safely uncontroversial. Miss Marple, preparing for her departure, paid one last visit to the rose garden. The Queen Adelaide roses had been carefully replanted where possible. New cuttings had been set into the soil with cautious optimism. Lady Hawthorne supervised the work personally. They may take time, she said, but they will recover. Yes, Miss Marple said. Roses are remarkably resilient. They walked together for a short distance. "You have a way," Lady Hawthorne said abruptly, "of making people say more than they intend." Miss Marple smiled. "People often wish to be understood. They simply don't realise it." Lady Hawthorne stopped beside the stone wall. "I built my life on control," she said. "Order, predictability. And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "one cannot plan for everything." "No," Lady Hawthorne agreed, "but one can endure." That afternoon, Inspector Graves came to say goodbye. "You should consider consulting work," he said half-jokingly. "There are cases—" Miss Marple shook her head. "I prefer my village. One can see quite enough of the world from there." He hesitated. "Do you think—" He stopped, then continued. "Do you think Gerald Pritchard believed he would get away with it?" "Yes," Miss Marple said without hesitation. "Because he believed he understood people better than he did." Inspector Graves nodded slowly. Miss Marple's final evening in Little Wetherby was quiet. She packed, knitted, and wrote a short letter to her nephew, thanking him for his hospitality. Outside, the village settled into its familiar rhythms. Doors closed, lights dimmed, and the distant sound of a radio drifted through an open window. From her room, Miss Marple looked once more toward Hawthorne House. The garden lay in shadow, its paths pale in the moonlight. Somewhere among the roses the scent lingered. Soft, insistent, impossible to ignore. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was much the same. Cultivated carefully, it could produce great beauty. Neglected, or exploited, it could be deadly. The next morning she would leave. Little Wetherby would continue, a little wiser perhaps, though she doubted it would admit as much. And Miss Marple, stepping back into the familiar comfort of St. Mary Mead, would carry with her yet another small confirmation of something she had always known. That evil rarely announced itself loudly. It preferred tea, good manners, and a rose garden in full bloom. Chapter 11. Matters of Memory. Miss Marple did not, in fact, leave Little Wetherby the next morning. A telephone call arrived just after breakfast, one of those quiet, urgent calls that altered plans without appearing to do so. Inspector Graves, sounding apologetic, asked whether she might spare another day. "There is a small matter," he said. "Perhaps nothing. But I should value your opinion." Miss Marple agreed at once. Small matters, she knew, were often the most telling. The issue concerned Monica Pritchard. While Gerald Pritchard's confession had been detailed and emphatic, Monica's statement was less straightforward. She had admitted to placing the crushed tablet in Colonel Hawthorne's tea, but her recollection of how the idea had first been introduced was, Inspector Graves felt, curiously vague. "She insists it was Gerald's plan," the inspector explained when they met later that morning. "Which I believe. And yet there's something oddly rehearsed about her account." "Rehearsed statements," Miss Marple said gently, "are often designed to protect someone. Not always the person one expects." Inspector Graves frowned. "You think she's protecting Gerald?" "I think," Miss Marple said. "She's protecting her own idea of herself." They drove together to the small holding facility where Monica was being kept pending transfer. She looked diminished now, her nervous energy replaced by a dull, exhausted resignation. When Miss Marple entered the room, Monica stared at her as though seeing her for the first time. "I never meant it," Monica said suddenly. "You believe that, don't you?" Miss Marple sat down opposite her. "I believe you meant something else." Monica twisted her hands. "Gerald said it would only scare him, that men like Colonel Hawthorne only understood weakness when it was shown to them." "And you believed him," Miss Marple said. "Yes. He was always so certain." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Pritchard, Monica, when did you first think of Lady Hawthorne's tablets?" Monica blinked. "Gerald told me." "Did he?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Or did you tell him?" There was a long silence. Monica swallowed. "I was there when Lady Hawthorne collected the prescription. She asked so many questions, I thought how dangerous it sounded." "And you mentioned this to your husband," Miss Marple said, not unkindly. "Yes." "And he," Miss Marple continued, "recognised an opportunity." Monica's shoulders sagged. "I only said it in passing. I didn't mean—" "No," Miss Marple said gently. "But once said, it could not be unsaid." Inspector Graves, listening from the corner, said nothing. When they left, he exhaled slowly. "So it began with her." "It often does," Miss Marple said. Ideas are like seeds. One never knows which will take root. The inspector nodded. It won't change the charges. But it does clarify things. It always does, Miss Marple said. Eventually. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Lady Hawthorne once more. She found her in the study, sorting papers with meticulous care. "I hear you are leaving tomorrow," Lady Hawthorne said without looking up. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, barring any further disturbances. Lady Hawthorne's mouth tightened briefly. "One hopes." Miss Marple hesitated, then spoke. "I thought you might like to know. Monica Pritchard did not act from malice, only from foolish loyalty." Lady Hawthorne looked up sharply. "Loyalty," she repeated, "a quality much admired and very poorly understood." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. Lady Hawthorne gathered the papers into a neat stack. Arthur once said that Gerald Pritchard would ruin himself eventually. He was quite certain of it. And yet, Miss Marple said, he still agreed to meet him. Lady Hawthorne sighed, a small, controlled sound. "My husband believed that civility was a form of protection." Miss Marple smiled sadly. "Many people do." That evening, little Weatherby held a quiet meeting in the village hall, ostensibly to discuss the upcoming harvest festival, but in truth to reassure itself that life was once again proceeding according to plan. Inspector Graves attended briefly, offering a few carefully chosen words about due process and patience. Miss Marple sat at the back, listening. "We must put it behind us," someone said. "These things don't belong here," said another. Miss Marple thought of St. Mary Mead, of other villages, other rose gardens. Belonging, she reflected, had very little to do with geography. After the meeting, Evelyn Carter approached her. "I'm glad you stayed," Evelyn said, "even for a little longer." "So am I," Miss Marple replied. Evelyn hesitated. "Do you think, after all this, people will remember Colonel Hawthorne kindly?" Miss Marple considered. "People remember what suits them, but the truth has a way of persisting." Evelyn smiled faintly. "That's something, at least." That night, Miss Marple finished packing. She placed her knitting carefully at the top of her suitcase, folded her cardigan, and closed the lid with a quiet click. She slept well. In the morning, the village looked as it always did. Hedges trimmed, doors freshly opened, life resuming with practised ease. Inspector Graves came to see her off. "I doubt we shall meet again," he said. "One never knows," Miss Marple replied. "Villages have a way of repeating themselves," he smiled. "If they do, I hope you're nearby." As the car carried her away from Little Weatherby, Miss Marple looked back one last time. Hawthorne House stood serene in the distance, its garden orderly, its roses beginning another cycle of growth. Memory, she thought, was like a garden too. One could choose what to cultivate and what to prune. But the soil remembered everything, and sometimes, despite one's best efforts, something poisonous bloomed. Miss Marple closed her eyes and settled back. St. Mary Mead awaited her, and with it, no doubt, the familiar comfort and quiet peril of human nature. Chapter 12. A Necessary Doubt. The train that would take Miss Marple back to St. Mary Mead did not depart until mid-afternoon, and she had several quiet hours in which to reflect. Reflection, she found, was best done without haste, preferably with a cup of tea and a view that invited the mind to wander. She took her tea in the small sitting room of her nephew's house, the window open to the late summer air. Little Weatherby sounded entirely itself again, a lawn-mower in the distance, a dog barking once and then falling silent, the faint rumble of a delivery van on the high street. And yet, Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. Something, small, irritating, and persistently unresolved, refused to settle into place. Inspector Graves had his case. Gerald Pritchard had confessed. Monica Pritchard had corroborated the essentials. The physical evidence supported the narrative neatly enough. By all sensible standards, the matter was finished, but sensible standards, Miss Marple knew, were not always sufficient. It was not the crime that troubled her. It was the shape of it. She rose and walked slowly to the window. The garden below was modest and well kept, lacking the grandeur of Hawthorne House, but not its order. Order, she reflected, was often mistaken for truth. The Colonel had been poisoned by tea prepared at the fete. That much was clear. The digitalis had weakened him, and the arranged meeting had placed him precisely where the collapse would be most dramatic. But drama, Miss Marple thought, was rarely the chief concern of genuinely clever criminals. Convenience was, and there was one element of convenience she could not quite reconcile. Gerald Pritchard, for all his faults, had been a cautious man. He dealt in property, contracts and committees. He liked his risks calculated, his gains predictable. To involve his wife directly, to rely on her fragile nerves and uncertain judgment, seemed untidy. Monica had been useful, yes, but she had also been dangerous. Miss Marple frowned slightly. She finished her tea and on impulse put on her hat. If one was troubled by doubt, she believed, it was best to address it directly. Inspector Graves was at the temporary office set up near the village hall, sorting paperwork with the air of a man eager to conclude his duties. He looked up in mild surprise when Miss Marple was shown in. "Have you forgotten something?" he asked. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "or perhaps I've remembered something too late." He gestured to a chair. "I'm listening." Miss Marple sat down and folded her hands. "You told me," she said, "that Gerald Pritchard confessed fully." "Yes." "And that he admitted persuading his wife to administer the poison." "Yes." "Did he ever explain," Miss Marple asked, "why he involved her at all?" Inspector Graves frowned. "He said he needed access to the tea service, and an excuse to be near it." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "But he was chairman of the parish council. He moved about the fete freely. No one would have questioned his presence." The inspector considered this. "True enough." "And he was," Miss Marple continued, "a man who disliked leaving loose ends." Inspector Graves leaned back slightly. "You think Mrs. Pritchard knew too much?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that she knew too much afterward, which is a risky thing." The inspector was silent. "There is another point," Miss Marple added. "Gerald Pritchard wished to frighten Colonel Hawthorne, so he claimed. But the Colonel was not a man easily frightened. He was stubborn, proud, and accustomed to confrontation." "Yes," the inspector said slowly. "That fits." "To frighten such a man," Miss Marple said, "one would need more than a mild collapse. One would need certainty, a sense of real danger." Inspector Graves' eyes sharpened. "You're suggesting intent." "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said, "that Gerald Pritchard may have intended exactly what happened." The inspector exhaled. "That does not contradict the case." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but it does alter our understanding of it." She rose. "I only wish to be sure," she said. "Certainty is a comforting thing, but it must be earned." Inspector Graves stood as well. "You believe the truth is complete?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I believe it is sufficient, which in life is often the best we manage." Before leaving the village, Miss Marple paid one final call, this time on Dr. Wells. He received her with some surprise. "I thought you'd gone," he said. "Almost," Miss Marple replied. "But I wanted to ask you something." "Of course." She seated herself. "Did Colonel Hawthorne ever consult you about his heart?" she asked. Dr. Wells hesitated. "No, he disliked doctors." "And yet," Miss Marple said, "you said his heart was weaker than you realized." "Yes, age, strain, and shock," Miss Marple added quietly. Dr. Wells frowned. "Shock?" "A realization," Miss Marple said. "Something unexpected." Dr. Wells's expression changed slightly. "You think he knew?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that when he felt the first symptoms, he understood precisely what had been done to him." Dr. Wells said nothing. "That knowledge," Miss Marple continued, "would have hastened matters considerably." Dr. Wells nodded slowly. "Yes, fear can accelerate cardiac failure." "Not fear," Miss Marple said softly. "Betrayal." She rose, thanked him, and left. The train platform was nearly empty when Miss Marple arrived. She sat on a wooden bench, her suitcase at her feet, and watched a porter amble past with unhurried purpose. The case, she knew, would proceed as expected. Gerald Pritchard would be convicted. Monica Pritchard would serve a lesser sentence, pitied by many and understood by few. Lady Hawthorne would resume her carefully ordered life. Evelyn Carter would teach and perhaps thrive. And little Weatherby would remember the affair selectively. What it would not remember, what it could not bear to remember, was how easily civility had been used as a weapon. How politeness, routine, and trust had smoothed the path to murder. The train arrived with a soft hiss of steam. As Miss Marple settled into her seat, she allowed herself one final reflection. The most dangerous crimes, she had learned, were not those committed in passion, nor even those born of desperation. They were the ones planned by people who believed themselves entirely reasonable, people who told themselves they only meant to nudge events in a more favourable direction. Miss Marple smiled faintly and opened her knitting. Human nature, she thought, required vigilance, not outrage, and vigilance, like knitting, was a matter of patience, attention, and the careful correction of small mistakes before they became impossible to mend. The train began to move. St. Mary Mead lay ahead, and somewhere, inevitably, another village was already congratulating itself on being perfectly safe.